Okay, great. So yeah, that's me trying to send live video of penguins from Antarctica. I did that work, that kind of work for a long time, but now I'm focused a lot more on the work that I do with the Almanaque Azul collective, which is a small group of people that started, for which I started making maps 20 years ago for that travel guide. We made a travel guide and we didn't have any money and nobody wanted to make maps for free, so I had to learn how to make maps. The last project we worked on was earlier this year, together with our colleagues from the indigenous mapping collective Geoindígena, these guys here. It was in the Darien with 2 Embera communities where 500,000 migrants made a stop after walking through the jungle on their way to Panama. We did some participatory mapping exercises with them, and I will be super happy to talk over beer or coffee about the completely crazy, deranged situation of migrants in these continents that I witnessed firsthand. So this is the map that I'll be presenting. It's a map of nature corridors of Panama, okay? Actually, I might start passing, if you can give you can just take a look at the final result. Let's give a little bit of context. So that's Panama from space. There's like parallels and lines on Earth from space. It's kind of the thinnest part of the Americas, and it's a little bit the boundary between Central and South America. And here is a map of ecoregions, just to remind us that Mother Nature doesn't care about national boundaries. Although, of course, boundaries can modify the ground, we can see that ecosystems overlap nation states. The Isthmus of Panama was formed about 3 million years ago, became a land bridge between North and South America, and it's still playing that role of being a land bridge of species moving across, right? So that's the coastline of Panama. Those are the Pacific and the Caribbean Ocean and Sea. That's why there's a canal in Panama. And the whole country is kind of divided in these two halves, Caribbean and Pacific, and half the rivers flow to the Caribbean, the other half flow to the Pacific. Climate is different, species are different, not totally, but there's a significant difference between one and the other side. And then this is a land use map showing mostly forests. For me, a trained biologist from Panama, nature means forest. And then, of course, there's the oceans. And when I moved to Mexico, I realized that there's other types of nature, that there's like arid nature and so on. But for us in Panama, it's forest. This is what we're concerned about, forests, right? So these are the borders on top of the landscape. We're talking about 75,000 square kilometers. That's the size of Panama, which is more or less the same size as the Navajo Nation or South Carolina. That's Panama, right? And then out of these 75,000 square kilometers, a bit over 60% is forest. So that's a lot of forest for a country, right? And here then we have these areas, which are indigenous territories, autonomous indigenous territories. Since 1925, Panama has had autonomous territories where it's not really a reservation. It's actually a piece of land that people control, and they have local laws and so on, with a certain connection to the state. And that's about 20%, a little bit over 20% of the country. Most of it, almost all of it, overlaps forests. And they are actually custodians, indigenous peoples, of a bit over half of the forests in Panama. So that's the context, right, of this map. Now, back to corridors. We call this the map of Panama's natural corridors, which is showing how species, how living beings move around this landscape. It's a map of what is called structural ecological connectivity. And when I say species, I'm not talking only about hairy animals. I'm talking about birds, butterflies. I'm talking about plants, trees, mosses, everything, right? So that's a map we made, and I'll be talking about why it looks like this and why we think it's good, what we think it's good for, right? The dark green polygons, can I take this out? Is it feasible? Maybe let's take that one. So the dark green polygons are the ones with the highest conductivity, so that species it's easier for them to pass through. And this one here is what's called the Mesoamerican Biological Corridor, which is something you may have heard about. The history of the Mesoamerican Biological Corridor is very interesting itself. The way in which it began at a purely conservation idea for jaguars to move around. We could say that it came from the more conservative, some people would even say colonial, side of environmentalism. It then became a tool in the march of neoliberalism in Central America and Colombia in the 90s. And then eventually, after lots of millions of dollars flowed to it, it kind of disappeared and vanished. But the idea of this path for jaguars, for animals that just passed through Panama, Central America, from Colombia, but came from the south, kind of stayed there and became really strong. So what do we mean when we talk about animals moving around? Landscape connectivity can be defined as the extent to which landscape facilitates or impedes the movement of organisms. So we lost the last part there. And also a measure of the ability of species to move between habitat patches. Again, it's not only jaguars, but all kinds of things. And living beings, and this includes humans, have always moved and needed to move. This is from the Central America map that was next door. So there we have humans moving, humans who are living there, and birds moving around. So that's always happened, right? That's totally normal. So this is the fantastic Audubon Bird Migration Explorer, which tells us a little bit the story of why birds move. Maybe they're looking for new places to live or better places to live, looking for sexual mates to find food, for many reasons. This is the normal thing, right? But as you could imagine, just like it is now much harder for humans to move around the landscape than it was 100 years ago, there are all kinds of barriers now for non-human species. Everything became more fragmented with capitalism, modernity, urbanization, reaching a lot more spaces than it did before. And the thing is that things need to move, especially with climate change. There's this thing called climate connectivity. So the ability of living beings to move in response to climate change. So the simplistic, which is a synonym for scientific way of looking at things, is that it's 17 kilometers per decade towards higher latitudes. So from the north to the north, or from below the equator to the south, or 11 meters per decade going up the mountain. This is, of course, not so simple, because there are all sorts of microclimate effects and interactions and different levels of tolerance for different animals. But in general, and especially now with climate change, we want things to be connected, and it turns out things are not terribly connected in the world. Only 34% of protected areas across the world have some sort of connectivity. In the US, that's 41% of natural areas, which means that the rest of them are isolated, right? That there's no real connectivity between them, and that's only 38% of tropical forests. So, the project again. We wanted to create a tool for our colleagues in the environmental movement. Our idea was to make something to help folks figure out what needs to be done, what are the hotspots, right? What is under threat, what we have to pay more attention to or keep healthy. So our audience is basically organized community members. When we say organized, we're talking about things like local water committees, people who have some interest or some idea about their forest, their environment, and so on, or simply organized indigenous communities, people who get together and discuss what's going on with their lives, which is something that a lot of us don't do in our daily lives, right? But also, we wanted to support city-based environmentalists, and also to focus on school students. So you could say that this is like an independent science project that is directed specifically for activists and organized communities. Now, telling the story of what Panama is about, this is also our idea, to tell a story about it, because it's something that we're really interested in. All countries tell themselves stories about what they are. And we think Panama is a country of not only the canal or whatever it is, Panama Papers that you may think of when you think of Panama, but it's a country of nature, biodiversity, cultural diversity, and so on. And exactly a year ago, something happened in Panama that had to do with this story of how Panamanians see themselves. This happened about a year ago. Things really exploded in Panama. This is supposed to play itself, I don't know. There was like a huge environmental uprising in the country that happened in October last year. This is Panama City, right? There was a lot of people on the streets. This lasted for about a month, and people were using a slogan saying, "El oro de Panamá es verde," which means Panama's gold is green. So there were many reasons why this happened, but in the end, it was an ecological uprising. People were protesting against a mine against a mining contract that the Panamanian government had signed to keep this horrible, horrible, destructive mine running, right? And it was all over, throughout the country, right? Eventually, the government was forced to cancel the contract and actually prohibit all metal mining in Panama, which is a huge thing, right? We have had quite a few ecological uprisings happening here in the US and around the world, and it will keep on happening, right? We actually want more of this to happen. So the thing is, I want us to think about how our maps can support these very necessary rebellions. So that's the context where this map is landing. Our idea is that it will be a tool to make decisions, data and evidence-based decisions to inform our work as activists and community leaders. Now, how do we uncover ecological connectivity? I guess you all know what this map is, right? Okay, so if you are in a rush, you can actually use this raster to make a map of structural connectivity, which is calculated at the landscape level using land cover data. How does it work? In 2008, Brad McRae, who was an electrical engineer, published this article in the journal Ecology. So it's not usual to see electric circuits in a journal called Ecology, but this electrical engineer realized that he could use circuit theory to model connectivity on the landscape. And this method has been extensively developed and refined and tested, and it works really well. So it analyzes a resistance surface, which is a raster where each pixel has a value that says how much it resists the movement of living things, right? So this could be used if you just give light a value of 1 or 100, and then no light a value of 0. And then you can run this through an application that McRae created, which is free and open source, called Circuitscape. Just before he died, he made a more advanced or different version called Omniscape, which is the one that we used, right? McRae made this map, connectivity map for the Nature Conservancy of the Pacific Northwest, and this is the result, and it actually is called current flow. So this is the name of the things that come out, 5 minutes, okay. So that's the map of this area where we are right now. You can download the rasters. This is a map of the whole of North America with a 1 kilometer resolution. And the reason why the resolution is so big is because it takes a long time for these models to run. And the thing is, we think this could be explained better, right? Very quickly, the resistance surface that we used was a combination of rasters and vectors like OpenStreetMap data, like rivers who were classified, population density, which as you see is very similar to night lights. So we put this all together in this resistance surface with certain categories, like 11 or 12 categories, and then we interviewed a bunch of experts who would tell us the score of each category. So what about this? What's the conductivity of this compared to a shopping mall, compared to a mine, or to cattle ranching? So we gave each of the pixels in that map a number that you can see down there. And if you get closer, then you can see the darkest forest. Then we have things like this road passing through. It's probably a road. Then we have population, which has a buffer of 1 kilometer with a Gaussian blur so that it kind of fades out. So that's the effect of humans in the landscape. And things like the shore, lake shore. So if it's close to the shore or farther from the shore, each of these things has a number, right? There's an alternative. There's the global human modification thing, layer that you can use, but it's 300-meter resolution, which doesn't work for a thin country like Panama. So it looks like that, right? Then we take this raster, we run it through computers. That's my illustration of running it through. It's no better one. And this is what comes out. This is the current flow raster where each pixel has a conductivity value. But again, we struggled to figure out what to do with this. We thought this doesn't tell a story. This is not really working. And it was literally months of playing around with this raster, doing things like trying to give it some sort of a shaded relief to see how it could explain what we wanted, right? And in the end, the result was, what we did was vectorizing the raster, which is a talk that I missed yesterday. So we created categories for the raster, made polygons, and then these polygons became these corridors. And then we gave each of these corridors a name. Naming things can be very colonial. We are aware of that. This is only version 1, and we expect to have feedback to rename things. And then we had this corridor here, which is connecting this super important area with this. And we were like, wow, this is so important. We didn't know it existed. We couldn't see it before. So we're like, what's happening here, right? So I look up the high part of the Santa Maria River basin. Turns out that there was a bunch of people who were already organized there, protecting that area, who knew that this area was important, protecting it against mining and big hydro. So we think it is something that can be very helpful for other people who don't know to support the struggle. And I think they agree because they were there when we were presenting the map. So you have the actual map. This map is created for schools. So there's a lot of information. There's the raw data or rawish data on one side and the more processed map on the other side. With, you know, where forests are coming from and so on. There's letter size PDFs that you can download, teachers can download and print. There's a black and white version with patterns. I'm not so sure that it works really well. There's a web version. It's done with open layers and with proto-maps serverless. And this is the QR. QRs don't have to be black on white background. You can play around with them and make them a little bit nicer. And then we printed 5,000 of this. They're already gone, and we're printing more as we speak. We can talk about if you want to keep, if anyone is interested in them. We liaised with the teachers union and activists, and we ended up receiving images like this of students receiving their maps, community leaders getting their maps all over the place. It's so nice to see the back of people pointing at your map. This is something that I really love to see. So that's it. Thank you.
Thanks. Adam? Come get set up. And any questions for Mir? I have a question. What's the corridor over the canal?
Yeah, there is no corridor over the canal. So there is, the canal itself is a big blockage, right? So we still get birds and so on, and we know more or less which areas they're passed through, but there's really no corridor over the canal. So it's like kind of a barrier.